So when you think about digestion, when you think about waking up, when you think about falling asleep, when you think about the energy and the mood that you have, these are all controlled by that thing in the sky, right? All right, what is up, everybody? Episode 17, A Pursuit of Balance. We're going to talk about some changes that we should all be thinking about making during the wintertime. And a lot of this, I think, biologically or evolutionarily, is something that we did organically by ourselves, right? We just made these changes because that's what life provided us. So now, in the modern day world, one of the things that we struggle with is this comfort crisis of, dressing warm and heaters in the house and lights that can keep us up late at night. But the thing that we need to remember is our genes and our biology actually should be going through some changes throughout the year, right? This is something I do talk about every year, and I try to talk about, obviously as we're ending in the wintertime, as you guys are hearing this is beginning of November. So I want to share this with you guys and kind of some of the things that I personally go through as far as changes on the dietary side, on the, light exposure side, the movement side. Training doesn't have too much volatility for me personally, but I'll share some of those things. But kind of want to start with the light because obviously the light is where, all these changes are really kind of being stemmed from, right? So when you think about this, is like, as humans, right, we are designed to be out during daylight, right? We're not nocturnal. So what happens is as we enter these winter months, we have shorter daylight, right? We have shorter days, right? Meaning it's going to get darker earlier, it's going to get darker later in the morning kind of thing. And most of us don't really think about, okay, well, that should, have some changes biologically to how I feel, what I do. I know a lot of us talk about like, the winter blues or the seasonal affective disorder where we kind of start to feel like our mood changes, but there's reasons why that happens and it's biologically happening to us, right? So from a light perspective, think about it this way. Let's start with two things, right? Two hormones that are really going to kind of regulate a lot of this, and this is going to be regulated based off from light. Melatonin, cortisol, right? These two hormones are actually going to be the inverse relationship from each other as far as the timing of their peaks and their troughs throughout the day on this 24-hour circadian cycle. Our melatonin, as we all know, should be peaking at the night, right? Which is allowing us to go to bed and feel sleepy, right? And our cortisol is going to peak in the morning, which is the thing that's going to be waking us up. So when you are aligned on a circadian perspective, these two should have a nice, healthy, inverse relationship from each other. And I will say this, not even just as a winter thing for us, but also as a summer thing that, with screens and TVs and lights in the house and LEDs, all these things, a lot of us tend to kind of have a screwed up cycle between these two, right? Or late night eating or late night caffeine or late day, whatever you want to call it. Cortisol, as most of us think, as we think about that as the stress hormone, but there's a lot of things that make cortisol very healthy to have. Melatonin is what most of us think about as kind of like this sleepy hormone, right? But there's a lot of antioxidants and a lot of longevity stuff behind melatonin as well. But, excuse me. But melatonin, little fun fact, first one that I wrote down was melatonin itself is actually an 85, this is something I just learned, bright light at night can suppress melatonin by 85%. But melatonin, actually, we produce 80% more in the wintertime than we do the summertime. So this could be one of those topics of conversation of like, is this something that's causing us to feel sleepier because of that? Or is this something that we should actually be paying attention to and inviting and maybe sleeping more? And I would be on the latter. I think that one of the things that we should all be trying to do is take advantage, and think about this too, is not strictly just a biological conversation, right? Think about this also as just like a lifestyle conversation, right? Most of us tend to be more active, more energized in the summer months, right? It's warm, there's more daylight, it's the summer vibe. We tend to just be doing more throughout the day, right? And throughout that season, more importantly. I don't know how you guys feel, but when I get into the winter months, I just feel like this natural slowing down of motivation, of energy, of mood. The mood is actually a serotonin thing, right? So one of the things that we need to remember about vitamin D and melatonin and UVB, which is actually what's kind of producing all this stuff, is that's actually the thing that's going to help convert tryptophan into serotonin. And serotonin is what most of us know is kind of like this happy hormone, right? So serotonin is what makes us feel alive, what makes us feel good, makes us feel happy. And with less sun exposure, you have less serotonin production too, right? So this is kind of where we get some of these effects, both from the vitamin D suppression, from the melatonin increase. So we want to pay attention to those things. But coming back to that lifestyle piece, one of the things that I've always kind of like preached and kind of even more importantly, just like lived myself is trying to take the winter as a time to kind of restore and reflect, right? I think like when you look at the micro or the macro, like from a day perspective or a week perspective or an annual perspective, we have these like unconscious built-in periods of like hustle and rest, right? Some of us have a hard time shutting off the hustle part, and that's where we kind of lack on the rest and recovery and where we're a little bit more stressed out and anxious. And some of us maybe lack a little bit on the hustle side period, but whatever. We're not going to talk about that. So I want you guys to think about from like a winter perspective, just to kind of start that conversation, that use the winter months not as an excuse to be lazy, but as a reason to kind of relax and restore a little bit more. For my industry and my job specifically, I probably didn't make this change really kind of consciously till about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, where I was like, I already have my clients gone, and I would just try to fill up my schedule. Versus what I've done now is like when I have clients traveling because of the winter months, because as soon as Halloween happens, like it has last week, then it's like next thing you know, it's Thanksgiving. Next thing you know, it's Christmas. Next thing you know, it's New Year's. And it's like, boom, holy shit, it's already the beginning of January. So I always say that Halloween to like mid-January just feels like it goes by so fast. But instead of like making that a stressful thing, because most people I think with, well, I'm sure there's a little bit of kind of the holiday start. Well, actually, to be honest with you, I have a little bit of that sometimes too. I think holidays can be stressful, but that's depending on how you treat those, right? But I think overall, like I said, use this time of the year and use this season as a little bit more restoration, right? But from a light exposure, let's get back to that, right? So let's get back to kind of some of the science and the biology of it. One of the big things we need to remember is, from a vitamin D perspective, we get this, as most of us know, from sunlight, right? And sun exposure. And as most people do naturally, is when it's cold, we spend less time outside, meaning I'm getting less exposure to the sun, which is obviously going to suppress vitamin D, right? And this is where a lot of times when you hear like we're entering a cold season or the flu season, we're in reality, one of the kind of arguments I always like to kind of challenge and think about too is like, are we also just entering a season where we're doing a lot less of the right things, right? Like, are we getting less movement and walking? Are we getting less sun exposure, right? Because these are things that are vital to our immune function and to our health. So one of the things that you guys really want to focus on during the winter months is challenge yourself to get outside still as much as possible, right? Like, I know it's harder to convince myself to go walk the dog when it's 45 degrees in the morning versus when it's 60, 70 degrees in the morning. I get it, right? I know it's like harder to convince myself to like not bundle up and wear a bunch of clothes because I want to fight being cold, which I'll touch on that in a second. But it's like, it's good for us to actually adapt to the cold as well, because our bodies are adaptation machines. But if all we're doing is fighting this with comfort, meaning I'm using a heater all the time, I'm wearing a bunch of layers. You guys are obviously watching this video with me wearing a beanie and a sweatshirt, so I'm sure there's some context to that. But, we want to do things as close to our natural human being kind of perspective as we can, right? We don't want to get too far away from that, because that's where we start to see some of the negative health consequences fall downstream from that, right? So like I said, when you look at light, when you look at darkness, when you look at melatonin, the thing that I like to remember is like, just remember, you're releasing about 80% more melatonin in the winter months than you are the summer months, which means take advantage of having more quality sleep, having more quantity of sleep, and just restoring and recovering a little bit more, right? So one of the things I want you guys to think about from a light perspective is challenge yourself that, like, in the summer months, I think at the peak, it gets dark around 8, 8:30, sometimes even 9 o'clock. In the winter months, especially with the stupid daylight savings time, it gets dark, like it starts feeling like it's shutting down around 5, 6, 7 o'clock sometimes, right? So a good thing to challenge yourself to actually embrace the natural changes that are happening around us is to also make sure that your light is kind of following the same sequence, right? So as we have shorter days in the winter months, try to also shorten maybe some of the exposure that you get at home with, like, when the sun sets, Can I turn the lights off? Can I put some warmer lights on, right? So like a little, and I would say this is just kind of like a hack in general. Like I have red lights in our bedroom. You can have those like rock candles or salt light candles I'm talking about. You can put candles themselves, incandescent light bulbs instead of LEDs. Like do things that allow your body to kind of adapt to the circadian change that's happening, because that circadian rhythm is important for us to maintain. But when I say circadian rhythm, it's not the exact same amount of hours every single day of the year, right? Like in the wintertime, you're going to have more dark, which means that we should be paying attention to maybe less of that exposure. I talk about blue light glasses, a handful of times to people. So I think that's also something that no matter what, once again, summertime, maybe I start putting them on at 9 or 10 o'clock at night versus wintertime. Maybe I'm putting them on at like 7, 8 o'clock at night, right? Maybe putting them on a couple hours earlier. So, like I said, take advantage of obviously using this as a restoration phase of life, but understand that the light is one of those things that controls all circadian biology for the human body. So, when you think about digestion, when you think about waking up, when you think about falling asleep, when you think about the energy and the mood that you have, these are all controlled by that thing in the sky, right? So, understand that's going to be a huge thing, right? So, really, just the big takeaway from this one is learn to kind of dim your lights a little bit earlier when you get into the winter months. Next section I have written down: vitamin T, serotonin, vitamin D, not T, sorry, serotonin and mood. I kind of touched on this a little bit, right? Which is basically like UVB basically is virtually just disappearing in the winter months, right? Which is where we're getting a lot of the synthesizing of vitamin D production. And vitamin D, you need to remember, is something that controls over 200 plus functions in the human body. So it is one of those big hormones that has a lot of actions, and it has its hands in a lot of functions for the human body. So as you can imagine, when vitamin D drops, we're going to see some downstream effects that follow that, right? So like I talked about with the mood earlier, with the serotonin production, right? We talk about the immunal function that happens from that too. So when you think about all the things that the light is governing, once again, it's really, really important for you to make sure that you're prioritizing as much exposure outside, right? Because the more time that you can get outside, the better. And obviously, ideally midday, because that's where the sun's going to be the brightest. That's where you're going to get the most benefit. And, one of the kind of the hard things I would say the challenging part, a better way to say it, is like, there's a lot of it that's governed just from our eyes, right? Like our sun getting exposure through the eyes. And this is why, some people talk about like trying to, limit the amount of time that you're wearing sunglasses too, because like, you're kind of maybe missing some of that communication that comes from the eyes a little bit. But also we get a lot of that intake from skin absorption too, right? So ideally as much time outside, but getting your skin to be involved in part of the game as far as getting sunlight, this is going to be a big part of that too, right? So don't always try to be bundled up. Don't always try to go for the most comfortable route. Every once in a while, you got to challenge yourself, right? And this is just like the same stuff that I would share for you guys in the gym is like, it's going to be a little bit hard. It's going to be a little bit of a change, but adaptation requires there being a stimulus for adaptation, right? So if you're always doing something that's comfortable, you're basically lowering the body's need for adaptation, right? And this is why you see people that get sick. This is why you get people that get very depressed in the wintertime. So I'm talking about the things that we can do to hopefully remove as many of those obstacles that maybe come during the winter months that a lot of us run into, right? So from a supplemental perspective or even a dietary perspective, when you think about things like salmon, a little bit fish, mushrooms, things that have a little bit more vitamin D, like, yeah, maybe I should be adding a little bit more of that in my diet to kind of help combat that. Second thing is from a supplementation perspective. I'm pretty big on vitamin D supplementation during the winter months. I don't take vitamin D at all. I would say 9 months a year, but I would say during halfway through November, maybe December, I start, and I'll do that through February, right? Sometimes even March. A little bit of supplementation in the vitamin D, I think, just to kind of combat the lack of outdoor time that we have in exposure and just to help with overall, health and immunal function, right? So those are two kind of caveats, right? And I think the vitamin D was, if actually I will say this, COVID taught us that more than anything else, right? Everyone started supplementing vitamin D when COVID happened because they're like, oh, like vitamin D is the thing that helps us kind of fight this. And it's like, well, yeah, vitamin D is also the things that helps us fight majority of things in life. So keeping that at bay, I think is important. I don't think it's something I would really encourage people to be supplementing annually or year round. Because ideally, if we're doing our job correctly as humans, we should be outside and not need to be doing that. But supplementations do have their time and they do have their place. So that's going to be my big one. So next one's going to be 3, which is going to be metabolism, temperature, and energy, right? So I'm going to start with temperature first. I'm a huge sauna and cold plunge guy, right? And I think sauna, obviously, for me is much easier to do year round. I just crave heat. The cold plunge for me, just 6 years later of doing this pretty consistently, it still sucks. It's still something that I will say from a cold plunge perspective, I think I put more priority as far as the mental health benefits than I do on the so-called metabolic side or things like that, right? So there's one thing called brown, when you think about brown adipose tissue, right, which is basically like fat adipose tissue that has mitochondria in it. That is actually metabolically active, right? We have an increase in brown adipose tissue, right? Our body builds brown adipose tissue during the winter months as an adaptation towards cold, right? So a lot of people talk about this with cold plunge of like, oh, it's going to increase, it's going to allow your body basically to control core body temperature better and help regulate temperature a little bit more effectively because of the brown adipose tissue increase. So we get this increase, and I want to say it's like a 30 to 40% increase in the winter months. But there's nuance to this, right? So, this increase in brown adipose tissue is going to help us stay a little bit more insulin sensitive. It's going to help us stay a little bit more metabolically flexible. But we're actually not going to get that big of an increase if all you're doing is wearing layers on layers, and you're wearing pants, and you're wearing the thermal socks and beanies or heated vests or gloves, because what you're doing is to create comfort around cold. Your body doesn't need to go through that adaptation of increasing brown adipose tissue through the winter months. So, I will say is kind of like a little take home for people that one of the things that I really suggest is like still like even when I go to the park, right? Like I will walk on my little slides, my flip flops on the way to, take Kona out to the park. I'll take my shoes off all the time when I get to the grass and I walk barefoot. A little bit of grounding, a little bit of ooh, whatever. But I will say that in the winter months, it's very hard for me to consistently do that because I'm like, fuck, it's just so fucking cold on my feet. But that's the poor man's cold plunge, right? So I have a cold plunge. I try to actually keep as much of that as I can year round. But actually, I should actually have more priority around the winter months because I want my body to go through adaptation of cold. Now, it's hard because, like, when it's cold outside, I'd much rather just be in the sauna for 30 minutes and not do the cold plunge, right? There's nothing worse than getting out of a cold plunge when it's cold outside. But that training, once again, mentally for me personally, a little bit of emotional, right? Because I think just the emotional regulation of being able to train yourself to be calm in stressful situations is important for the brain on the emotional mental side. But as we're talking about, also from the metabolic side, it's important for us to have adaptation towards cold, right? So, and I'm speaking for, obviously I'm talking here in Mountain View, California, right? And they say like the longitudinal line where people start to have these vitamin D deficiencies is I think want to say for us in California is like LA and everything north, right? So obviously being in the Bay Area and anybody even north of us, it even becomes more and more extreme over time. So that's one thing is just like really reintroducing temperature contrast and getting your body actually adapted to the cold, right? So don't always fight. Now, I'm not saying like you need to be out in shorts and a tank top and just like go through it with grit. Like I think be smart. Like I'm still going to dress for comfort 80% of the time, but have these little micro doses of exposure around, the cold. So your body can regulate that a little bit more effectively. Okay. The next one, seasonal eating. So seasonal eating for me has been a bigger topic of conversation over I would say since the pandemic, because the pandemic is really where I started kind of like looking into this. And I've always kind of, as soon as I read about this and heard about this, I'm like, fuck, that makes so much sense. Like that we should be eating according to our geographical location, right? So I'll give you an example, right? If you lived in Costa Rica or you lived in a warmer climate or you live closer to the equator, you don't have almost any volatility from your winter to summer months. If anything, your winter months are the beautiful months because it's like it's not overbearing hot and humid. But for us and where I live, there is a lot of volatility. We get a lot of warmth, we get a lot of heat in the summertime, right? And then as we get in the wintertime, it gets cold, it gets windy, it gets rainy, and we have to change. Our outfits have to change, our lifestyles have to change, and just our motivation, I think, changes to do so, right? Because one of the things that I personally feel is like, I am way more motivated to do more in the summer months. I am way less motivated to do more in the winter months, which instead of fighting that and having friction around that, like I mentioned earlier, I invite it. I just say like, whatever, like let this be a slower time of month. Let me just slow it down. Let me reflect. Let me recover. Let me take it easy, enjoy everything that we did throughout the rest of that or throughout this year, right? Like, we only have 2 more months in 2025. So like enjoy what you went through the last 10 months too. But from an eating perspective, like think about this. Biologically, as far as what nature has provided us, right? whatever you believe in, God, the universe, doesn't matter. If you lived in Alaska, having acai bowls year round doesn't make sense geographically, right? Like you're not having a lot of fruit growing in Alaska, right? You're someone that's probably borderline eating keto. You're gonna eat a lot of protein, a lot of fat rich foods. You're gonna probably eat a lot more just animal meats in general because you're gonna have less quote unquote produce, right? You might be eating more root vegetables versus actual fruits and things like that. Now, if you're in Costa Rica, I don't think keto makes sense. It's like the sun's out, we're more insulin sensitive, we're probably moving more, we're sweating a little bit more. So that, nature has also been aligned to say, oh, okay, well, you also have a lot more fruit coming from things that are closer to the equator, right? So if you think about that on a geographical perspective, some places won't have much changes. If I'm in Alaska, I'm probably eating pretty similar year round because I don't have as much volatility in my summer and my winter months. If I'm eating somewhere around the equator like Costa Rica, yeah, there's not as much change. If you're kind of somewhere in the middle, yeah, you might get some pretty volatile changes, right? When I come back into Alaska, you still have some decent changes, obviously, when it comes to light. Um, but the equator, a lot less, right? So for us, one of the biggest hacks that I can give you guys and biggest tips, if you're someone that shops at the farmer's market, is farmers know better than you do, right? The grocery stores will always try to sell things year round. I think they're better at it now, but most of the times they'll sell things year round that maybe shouldn't be growing during this time of year, but they're like, okay, we'll get it from Mexico. We'll get it from, some other places in South America where they still have in their season of life, they'll have that produce growing. My biggest tip that I would give you guys is just understand that fruit by definition is going to be a little less accessible in colder months. So my thing is always like, okay, I'm just going to lower my carb intake a little bit. I'm going to lower my fruit and sugar intake a little bit if I can. Sugar has some nuance because I know it's hard for a lot of us around Halloween, Thanksgiving, Christmas, and holidays. But as far as what nature's intended us to do, I like to kind of transition into maybe getting a little bit fattier with some of my foods. And also think about it this way. Carbs for me, like white rice has always been that for me personally, but like carbs in general, I use that as my lever based off activity. If I'm walking a lot, I'm training hard, I'm moving a lot, I keep carbs relatively high. Like I never am someone that's like, oh, you should cut carbs, right? I think carbs can be the thing that we can kind of play around with as far as like when and where, depending on activity and time of year. When I get into winter months, unconsciously or consciously, I'm moving a little bit less, I'm sweating a little bit less, I'm less motivated to maybe train as hard. Maybe I'm changing my style of training. Maybe there's less aerobic stuff. I have no idea. I just know that I go through these changes unconsciously. And consciously, when I am doing that, I try to also consciously change my diet. So I might have a little bit, like I drink a lot more bone broth when I get to the wintertime personally. Doing things that I think are a little bit, like I call them the cozy meals, like do those things during the winter months. My smoothies in the morning, for example, I'm a big smoothie guy in the morning. I do fruits, tropical fruits, doesn't matter what it is, avocado, coconut water, protein, both whey and collagen, whatever other supplements I kind of feel like throwing in there. In the winter months, I will do maybe like berries instead of tropical fruits. I'll still maybe keep the avocado. Sometimes I'll even remove that depending on the season or how good they are. And then instead of coconut water, I'll just do regular spring water, right? So I do things that I try to stay kind of in alignment of like, do I need the extra calories and things from coconut water? Do I need the extra, fruits? And here's the thing. This might be kind of majoring in the minors a little bit, but for me, I think it's a way to have a cyclical approach to my nutrition, which allows me to kind of have a little bit more enjoyment. I don't know how you guys are, but I can't eat the same thing 52 weeks a year. Like I have to have some kind of little small changes throughout the year that kind of keep food or diet a little bit more exciting for me. So like that's something that I'll do, right? It's like, okay, I'm gonna obviously keep priority on the protein. I try to keep the priority of like having fiber. Maybe I'm doing more root vegetables. Maybe I'm even doing a little bit more vegetables, period, but root vegetables especially. Try to eat, some fruits that are going to be a little bit more aligned for winter months. So like oranges or pomegranates, things like that. Maybe less of some of these tropical fruits that we would see. So staying in alignment, I think, use the farmer's market. It's going to be the best hack. But adding a little bit more fat, lowering the carb intake, or maybe even just lowering calories overall is something that we should all be thinking about. Because if activity drops and your diet doesn't change, you will be someone that is going to gain a little bit of weight in the wintertime. So if activity drops, let's lower some of the things here, right? Let's lower some of these like unsatiating things like carbohydrates or sugars or sweets and bring them back as the things start to get warmer, or bring them back if your activity stays high. Now, if you are someone that's going to keep activity pretty high, then I don't think this is going to be as big of a deal for you, right? And another thing too is like, and from an intake of carbs and sugars, is roughly from what I saw, our insulin sensitivity drops about 30%, right? Meaning like we're less insulin sensitive. We want to be insulin sensitive. That's a good thing, right? And if we're less insulin sensitive in the wintertime, then we should be a little bit more aware of some of the sugars and carbs that are going to be affecting, obviously, from a blood sugar and insulin kind of relationship conversation. Those are things that we should just inherently be dropping a little bit too. So it's like my insulin sensitive drops by 30%. Maybe my carbs should too, right? So something to think about. So your foods, like I said, I think that's kind of up to you. I don't think there's a huge change in the modern day world for most people, but I think it's something that I would encourage a lot of people to kind of think about. The next one, winter sleep mindset. We kind of touched on this a little bit, right? I think I would try to increase the hours of sleep by at least 30 minutes to 2 hours, right? And this might not be easy for some, right? Our careers don't change. Our kids still wake up at the same time. Our kids still have school, right? Like all the things I think for most people that tend to be kind of, I don't want to say the excuse, the limitation, but this would be something from a family perspective. If you're listening to this and you have kids or your husband or wife's dealing with this too, like make sure that they're a part of this conversation, right? Like understand that like this is something for all humans, not just you listening to this. So going to bed a little bit earlier, like obviously waking up with light exposure, trying to stay in alignment with those things, maybe reducing caffeine a little bit earlier in the day versus the wintertime, because like if it takes you 6 hours to metabolize the caffeine, for example, it's like, well, yeah, if I had a cup of coffee at 4 p.m. in the summertime, I might be fine by the time I get to 9 p.m. and the light's still out, right? I'm still moving. But if I have one at 4 p.m. and it gets dark in 2 hours, might have a little bit of a different impact on kind of like you, right? And just how you sleep and the quality of that. So the last one, like I said, is just kind of the psychology and the mindset, right? So for me, it's like understand that there are some metabolic changes. There's some changes that happen on a biological level. Understand that nature, God or universe, whatever you believe in, has kind of provided us a way to kind of build in this restoration and just have these unconscious changes, right? And if we weren't living in a modern day world and we weren't exposed to technology, lighting, clothing, all these things, our body would go through this without even me having to talk to you guys about that, right? You would just go through these changes by yourselves, right? So the mindset is something that like I wanted to cap up of. It's like I think it's very important for us to just like take this opportunity for the next, 2, 3, 4 months, these colder months, and like don't stress yourself out. The holidays are stressful for so many people. The year-end planning for some people is very stressful. But I think like the slower months, it also should just be parallel to just kind of the slower lifestyle and slower mindset. Like understand that you've gotten to this place 10 months of working throughout this year, right? A couple of those months in the beginning being winter still, but enjoy it, right? Like it's kind of like the weekends for the week, right? It's like the weekends are just like a way for you to kind of have a little break. I know a lot of people like to say like, don't live for the weekends, but there's nothing wrong for living with any day. Ideally, yes, live through Monday through Sunday. Enjoy every part of your day. Yes, enjoy every season of life. But understand that like nature has provided a way for you to unconsciously be a little bit slower, right? So if you can take that opportunity to invite that period of life and invite that season, it's a lot more enjoyable. It's going to give you a lot more energy rolling into the next year and rolling into spring versus trying to fight it and think that I need to work hard. I need to push past these things. I need to do all these things. Don't get me wrong. You could still work hard. You could still exercise. On the exercise point, like I said, I don't really have much to change there. I mean, for me personally, I think just like coming back to this unconscious change, I'd probably do a little less cardio in the wintertime just because like I'm less motivated. Like if it's raining on the weekend, I'd rather watch football, right? If it's like instead of going on a ride, right? Or going on a run or doing a workout. So I think there's like a little bit of just change that happen unconsciously. As far as like would I recommend any changes for you guys in the training? Not really. I think really prioritizing the strength training. I think prioritizing the mobility, something that we do with our training as far as FL is we try to do a lot more like isometrics and pauses and tempo work and kind of built-in mobility work. A little bit of cardio just to kind of, so I try to keep the training pretty balanced because when I get into the next year after like, I think for most of us, what's interesting is like, evolutionarily, it's like we would actually get skinnier during winter months because we'd be hibernating. We're supposed to get bigger and fatter in the summer to kind of give us energy to survive winter. We don't have those circumstances anymore. And now what happens to the modern human is most people actually get bigger and gain weight and gain fat during the winter months. Understand that this is the hardest time of year for most people to quote unquote survive. I've always had this kind of joke, and I don't want it to be kind of funny for some, but like if you can maintain through these months, you've done a pretty good job through the winter months. Like from Halloween to the beginning of January, it's tough. Like you're traveling, there's candy. I'm fucking eating Twizzlers every day in Mountain View because we have a candy bowl here. So like I understand the things around us that create these changes for a negative, in a negative direction, but use them to kind of build systems around it, right? Or use them if you don't really want to change a lot of the dietary stuff, right? If you don't want to change your holidays too drastically, which I'm a big promoter of, then just, yeah, combat that on the other side of like, you're going to need to be a little bit more motivated to maybe do a little bit more cardio in the winter months. Because like if you're moving less and walking less, maybe your training should reflect a little bit more aerobic training. Maybe after your workouts, go on the rower, the skier, or the bike, or do a run. Do an easy 20-minute, like whatever, right? Just to burn a little bit more calories. So there's ways to balance it out, but I think you just need to understand for like you as the individual, what changes are you making consciously or unconsciously? Unconscious is hard to be aware of, so take time to reflect of like, hey, what am I actually doing? Like think about like, what are the changes that I'm actually doing unconsciously during the wintertime? Like make them more conscious by becoming more aware of them. And if there is some big changes, then make some changes on the other side of it. Or, like invite it and enjoy it, right? So that's up to you guys. All right, guys. Well, hope you enjoyed this one. I'll see you next week. Take care.